Thank you. Well, like Ian, I don't have a crystal ball, so where do I look to talk about the future of policing? But the past, first of all, and then from that try to develop some theoretical analysis, very ponderous term, but some understanding of what the nature of policing is, and in particular how to explain how policing functions and how it develops. And then thirdly, values. What do we want to happen? What would we like the future to be? Now, as you said, because actually I think we talked about this before, it's a coincidence, but chapter 2 of both of our books is the chapter about history, and that's where you have to begin. And I think the narrative, the basic facts of British police history are uncontentious, and we share them, but I think I have some differences from Ian's interpretation. And the basic story is very clear. I think, the struggle for acceptance of the police, which you talked about when they were originally created by Robert Peel, the huge opposition, which you mentioned Coldbath Fields, but when Cully was murdered, the PC who was killed in Coldbath Fields, there was an inquest held into it, and the inquisitor returned a verdict of justifiable homicide, because the very presence of the police at the riot, this is just 3 years after the creation of the police, was seen by many people as justifiable homicide. So there was virulent opposition to the police, but gradually and over time, the mass of the British public were won over, and eventually, when I was growing up in the 1950s, as you say, a long time ago, it was, I think, more common to describe the British police as the best in the world than it was for any of its rivals. I mean, I did find, as I later travelled the different police forces, a surprising number of them called themselves the finest or the best. But I think the British police were the one that was most uncontentiously described as the best. But then it began to unravel. And you talk about that, the development, your book is called Police and Controversies. There's an unravelling from, I think, roughly the 1960s, in which there's growing challenges and controversies. So where do I disagree? Well, one thing is that in the history chapter of my book, I distinguish between 3 different perspectives on British police history, and they don't differ fundamentally in the overall shape of the narrative, but they do very much in what the meaning of it is. And the first of these I call the cop-sided view of history, and Ian, perhaps unsurprisingly, in my view, exemplifies the cop-sided view. And what I think needs to be brought back into the picture is something I don't share either, but I described in the book as the lopsided view, which is the radical analysis, very critical analysis of the police. And what I myself argue for is a synthesis between the cop-sided and lopsided view that recognises that policing has an inherently double face. On the one hand, there's the police can be seen, as in the cop-sided view, as providing security, being guardians of the public to many people, but at the same time there's always the potential, very often the actuality, of oppression. And there are often the same actions are seen in different lights depending on where people are coming from, what their interests are. And policing, in other words, in my view, has a Janus face. It's got a double side. There is, it's necessary for any civilization where there are conflicts to have a police force, but on the other hand there's always the danger that policing will be partisan. Indeed, it's always going to be police against somebody. Policing by consent, which is supposedly the British tradition, is in literal terms an impossibility. If everyone consented to rules and to what was going on, there would be no need for police. So there is always, or almost always, somebody that is being policed against. And so policing is inherently controversial. As you said, it's inherently political. This is all summed up to me by a wonderful article by an American criminologist called Otwin Morenin, written about 30 years ago, on the nature of policing, called Parking Tickets and Class Repression. And our discussion before suggests that this is not as uncontentious as we might think. But what it means is to contrast the role of the police in providing the conditions of any kind of civilized coexistence, and that's the parking ticket factor. Now, of course, all of us, when we actually get parking tickets, don't think that the police are acting as agents of some universal interest, But nevertheless, I suppose if we stand back a bit, then at least the fair administration of parking tickets is necessary if we're going to have, any traffic and any movement at all in congested streets. On the other hand, the police have historically, and indeed always, acted in ways that are seen by some groups as class repression or other kinds of inequality in their application. And today, probably the most contentious issue is race. But so there is this double face of policing. I think what must never be lost sight of in view of that is that policing is about much more than the police, and the success of policing depends on much more than the police, and that's the number one thing I want to emphasise. The story of how did the police move from the position of being widely opposed to being very popular, kind of symbol of British national pride in the middle of the 20th century. I think there's a lot of elements of the British, the Peelian police tradition that explain it. The idea of minimising force, adhering to low legal powers, restricting the police to low legal powers compared to the ordinary citizen, have grown enormously more recently, but in the past, emphasising fairness and legality, and above all, the fact that they appeared to be successful during the course of the 19th century and the early 20th century in maintaining high levels of security and providing many useful services to people in trouble. But all these policies weren't successful just because they were brilliant policies. They were successful because of a wider social change. And that was the transformation of British society from the early 19th century up to the middle of the 20th century by the growth of what T.H. Marshall, a sociologist historian writing some decades ago, called the growth of citizenship, the growth of inclusion into a common status as citizens, spreading economic and social and civic rights to everybody. Now, obviously inequality remained, but there was a great attenuation of that, and that was the precondition for the success of the Peelian policies. And their unravelling wasn't because, as I think is commonly understood, commonly said, because the police somehow got worse. They lost the qualities they'd had. They carried on the same strategies, but what was different was after the 1960s was they were doing it in a different world, a world in which, especially with the advent of neoliberal economics, from the mid-1970s forced on the Labour government, but then enthusiastically taken up by the Conservatives after 1979, and then carried on by New Labour. There's been a reversal of the process of growing inclusion, growing exclusion, and more social tensions, which make it much harder for the policing, the strategy of policing by consent with minimal force, high legality and so on, to survive.